Last week marked 1 year since October 7th, 2023, when the Palestinian resistance launched an unprecedented historic offensive against the Israeli military bases and settlements that have besieged the Gaza Strip for 76 years. So much has been said in the last year about October 7th and about the Israeli death toll. But as regular viewers and listeners of this live stream will know, many of the Israelis were actually killed by Israel itself. Last week, Asa published a major new investigative piece about October 7th and how Israel unleashed its deadly Hannibal Directive that day. For the article, Asa looked back on a year's worth of our team's investigative reporting on the issue and highlighted revelations from several news sources. He concluded that Israel killed hundreds of its own people. It is a long read, and there's lots to get into here. So we're going to talk about it with Asa and with Ali, who have both been following the story closely from the very beginning. Let's start with you, Asa. One of the things that you get into in the piece is the Palestinian resistance's military objectives. You write that, quote, Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, as Hamas called it, was by any objective military measure a stunning success. Can you start by talking about that and about why you chose to make that the starting point for this feature, which is ultimately about why and how Israel killed so many Israelis?
Yeah, that's right, Nora. So it's interesting because it's not just me saying that. This was the assessment at the highest levels of the Israeli military itself on October 7th. And one of the main sources that I drew on in this piece was an article by the Israeli reporters Ronan Bergman and Yoav Zitun, who in January wrote this piece you can see on screen here in Hebrew only for the weekend supplement of Yediot Ahronot. It's called 7 Days, and they wrote this very long investigative piece based on their sources, which are almost entirely in the Israeli military hierarchy, the Israeli intelligence so-called community, and these are both military and intelligence reporters within the Israeli newspaper. Ronan Bergman is also a very high-profile reporter for the New York Times, and this long article was significant because it gives a almost minute-by-minute breakdown of what happened on October 7th up till the early afternoon from the point of view of the Israeli military. And it's significant to me that they haven't translated this article into English. We translated it. We got a professional translation, and we published the full translation. People can still read that. And in that article, it actually says very, very significant things. So first of all, on the Palestinian military offensive, there's a really significant quote. It says, quote, a senior officer said in a few words, a senior officer said a few words, the likes of which had not been heard since the Yom Kippur War of 1973. The Gaza Division was overpowered. These words still give me the chills, said a person who heard them then and there. This will remain a scar burnt into our flesh forever, end of quote. So this was what was being said on the day itself in the headquarters of the Israeli military. So it was a military success from that point of view, and even from the Israeli point of view. So, you know, the Palestinian resistance had these military objectives, and this is what is really so often forgotten in the mainstream Western media's sort of push to portray the offensive on the 7th of October as this evil terrorist attack. What happened was the primary objectives were military bases, and all the military bases were smashed and all the soldiers were killed, all taken as prisoners of war to Gaza, and many of the militarized settlements surrounding Gaza were also taken, and settlers were taken captive to Gaza as well, along with the soldiers, as we know. And it's because of these captives that the Hannibal Directive was unleashed. And it's worth explaining again, you know, our regular viewers and listeners will know, the Hannibal Directive is what I've described as Israel's National Murder-Suicide Pact. So it's a doctrine, a military doctrine, which was established in secret in 1986, which allows the Israeli military, in the event of capture of one of its soldiers, to actually target and kill its own soldiers rather than having them captured. And the reason for that is, over the years, the Palestinian resistance and the Lebanese resistance have managed to capture soldiers and then exchange them later on in negotiations for Palestinian prisoners. And this is viewed by Israeli planners as a kind of compromise too far. I get into all the history of it in the piece, and this piece you can see here on screen as well. We get into the history and the psychology of the Hannibal Directive. But also in that 7 Days article from January, those two Israeli journalists, Ronan Bergman and Yoav Zatoun, they confirm what we'd been seeing in video since the day itself. Quote, at midday of October 7th, the IDF, that's the Israeli military of course, instructed all its fighting units to perform the Hannibal Directive in practice, although it did so without stating that name explicitly. End of quote. There was a later piece by Haaretz's military reporter that you see on screen here, Yaniv Kubovich, and it stated in this piece from July that in fact the word Hannibal was explicitly used in orders issued by the Gaza Division, the local Gaza Division that besieges the Gaza Strip. And in that order, it was instructed that, quote, not a single vehicle can return to Gaza. Very significant. They shot and bombed the captives who were returning to Gaza with Palestinian fighters, of course, who had them in, who had detained them. They shot and bombed them with Apache attack helicopters, drones, tanks, and even in some instances, ground troops.
Right. Ali, as Asa mentions in the piece, EI was the first media outlet in English to publish the eyewitness account of Yasmin Porat, one of only 2 Israeli survivors of a massacre of Israeli captives carried out by Israeli soldiers in a house in Kibbutz Be'eri, a settlement less than 5 miles from the Re'im military base, which is the headquarters of, as Asa mentioned, the Gaza Division, and a primary target of the Hamas military offensive. Hamas fighters were trying to use her, Yasmin Porat, and another 14 captives as bargaining chips to help them return to Gaza unharmed. But Israeli troops arrived soon after and refused to bargain. Let's watch a short clip of what she said on Israeli radio soon after.
כוחותינו ירו בהם כשניסו לחסל את החוטפים, את החמאס.
הם חיסלו את כולם, כולל הבני ערובה, כי היה שם חילופי ירי מאוד מאוד קשים. אני משוחררת בסביבות השעה 5:30, ב8:30 כנראה מסתיימת הלחימה, אחרי שהיה חילופי אש מטורפים, אפילו 2 פקזים של טנק שירו לתוך הבית, שזה בית קיבוצי קטן, זה לא איזה, רואים את זה בחדשות.
כן.
זה לא מקום גדול. וברגע הזה כולם נהרגו.
So for our listeners, the radio show host asked Yasmin Porat in Hebrew, there was, quote, so our forces may have shot them. And Porat replies, undoubtedly, they eliminated everyone, including the hostages. And then she went on to explain that, quote, 2 tank shells were shot into the house, and at the moment they were killed. There was quiet. Ali, you and journalist David Sheen published that article on the electronic intifada only 9 days after October 7th, 2023. What have we learned since then about that specific incident?
Yeah, I just want to take the opportunity to highlight the incredible work David Sheen has done over the past year, most of it for the electronic intifada on this issue and related issues on October 7th. And he and I worked on several articles together, including including about this particular incident that took place at Pessi Cohen's house in Kibbutz Be'eri. And in a more recent long investigation, we concluded that most or almost all of the dead were highly likely to have been killed in the Israeli assault on the house. In our article, we showed how an Israeli army self-investigation of this incident is really a complete cover-up and contains a totally nonsensical and impossible timeline. And it basically completely clears Brigadier General Barak Hiram, who was the officer in charge and who ordered a tank to fire on the house, quote, even at the cost of the civilians, unquote, as he told the New York Times later. And what's so interesting about this is I referenced the New York Times there, but they only very briefly touched this story. That to this day, you can still find almost no coverage of this in what Layla Al-Arian just called legacy media or mainstream media. And the interview with Yasmin Porat, which she gave, I believe it was October 15th, 2023, so a week after the events of October 7th, to Israel State Radio. So this wasn't some obscure outlet. It was sort of national radio. Everyone in Israel heard it. And we published our story the next day. We had it, the whole thing translated. We wrote it up and we published it the next day. And nobody else did that in mainstream media. No one carried this account of Yasmin Porat. And not to mention all the other evidence that Asa has outlined that has come out since then. It's still absent from the official Western narrative. Now, I'll just say also that Hadass Dagan, who is the only other Israeli survivor of the incident at Pessi Cohen's house, insisted that everyone else in the house and around the house was either shot or burned completely by the Israeli tank fire. And as you can see in this footage here from an Israeli TV program, there's actual footage of the two Israeli tanks inside Kibbutz Be'eri. We also know, and this is documented in our reporting over the past year, that there were interviews broadcast on Israeli television with uniformed members of the Israeli military who were there as rescuers, talking about how they were shocked to look up and see not just tanks firing in Kibbutz Be'eri, but Apache helicopters firing missiles into Kibbutz Be'eri. So there's a lot that is known in Israel, even if it hasn't penetrated the mainstream narrative. It's been reported there, but isn't reported at all in Western mainstream media. The victims of this tank shelling included Hadass Dagan's husband Adi, as well as 12-year-old Israeli twins Liel and Yanai Hatzroni. They were killed by the tank shelling, but Liel's photo was actually used by Israel in its defamation campaign against Palestinians. For example, former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett posted on Twitter that Hamas had burned the girl to death, murdered in her home by Hamas monsters just because she's Jewish, is what Naftali Bennett said. And of course, it's an absolute lie. And it's a lie that is very obvious to anyone who takes even a cursory look at all the evidence, all of which has come from Israeli sources. So, yeah, I mean, I just want to say finally on this, that this particular incident at Pessi Cohen's house in Kibbutz Be'eri, even though I don't believe it's the only such incident in Kibbutz Be'eri, but it's the only one that has become very well known. And in my opinion, the only reason for that is because there were two survivors, Yasmin Porat and Hadass Dagan, who lived to tell the tale. Without their testimony, this would have all been completely covered up.
And as you said, that was one incident at Kibbutz Be'eri, but what about the rest of the region? How do we know that similar incidents happened, elsewhere around the Gaza envelope, so-called?
Yeah, well, there's a ton of evidence by now, and I get into most of it in the piece in detail. And something that was new in this particular article to our coverage was a report by the UN Human Rights Council's Commission of Inquiry, which was published in June, and it has confirmed this now. It confirmed the Hannibal Directive. This was a report which, it's the UN Human Rights Council. You can't quite say it's obscure, but it wasn't really covered certainly not the Hannibal aspect of it. It was covered, they released it at the same time as they did a report on Israeli war crimes in the Gaza Strip. And this was a kind of balancing, quote unquote, balancing report, right? Because they're sort of talking about what the Palestinian resistance did, and they accused them falsely, in my view, of war crimes and so forth in the report. And so at the time when this report came out in June, it was covered by mainstream media, but they sort of said, the UN says that there was war crimes by both Israel and Hamas. So that's how it was covered. But actually, if you read the whole thing, as I of course did, it has a 3-page section about the Hannibal Directive, and in that section of the report that you see on screen here, they said that there was, quote, strong indications that the Hannibal Directive was used in several instances on the 7th of October, harming Israelis at the same time as striking Palestinian militants, end of quote. And it even said that this is likely to have happened at the Supernova rave, which took place in the fields near the Re'im military base, the divisional headquarters of the Israeli military. What the report says about that is, quote, Israeli helicopters were present at the Nova site and may have shot at targets on the ground, including civilian vehicles. And it also states that, quote, 1 or 2 helicopters were present over the Nova festival site in the mid-morning hours. Now, Ali, actually, you first reported this in November, but I think it's significant, of course, that this has now been confirmed by the United Nations. That's Ali's article from the time there about that. Now, that long 7 days investigation that I mentioned earlier also details the Israeli military presence in the skies over the kibbutzes and over the rave, bombing captives from the air. Bergman and Zeytoun concluded that Israeli combatants were present all over the region, so it wasn't just Kibbutz Be'eri, and from very early on, within the first 24 minutes of the Palestinian assault, right? This is something that you hear quite often is, oh, the Israeli army was completely absent, it was nowhere, we were completely unprotected, and so on and so forth. It's not really true. There were Israeli combatants present all over the region. There's no doubt that the Palestinians caught them off guard and outgunned them briefly. But all over the region, there were Israeli fighters and Israeli military hardware present. So within this 7 days article, it details it, and it says that within the first 24 minutes of the assault, they scrambled at least 6 aircraft that we know, 2 F-16 bombers, 2 F-35 bombers, and 2 Hermes 450 drones, which are made by Elbit Systems, and the company that is, of course, the main target of campaigners such as Palestine Action. And there were also 2 more aircraft, Apache attack helicopters, who arrived at Kibbutz Be'eri within the hour. And the UN report says that it, quote, confirmed that at least 8 Apache helicopters were dispatched to the area around the Gaza border on the 7th of October, and that some 23 tanks were stationed throughout the whole border area with Gaza. Again, this is something we've been reporting from very early on. Ali, you did several reports at the time about the helicopter, again, based on translations of the Hebrew media, about the attack helicopters that were scrambled very early on. So it's all coming out again now.
Yeah. And Ali, there's cockpit footage of some of these shootings, right? As we saw that.
Yeah, and in fact, it's footage that has largely been released by Israel, probably all of it. I don't know who else would have had access to footage from Israeli attack helicopters, but they described it as showing them fighting, quote, Hamas terrorists. And as Asa pointed out, I wrote about some of it back in November in the article that you see there. And all the footage of these cockpit videos has been age restricted by YouTube, meaning that you need to be logged into an account and affirm that you're over 18 in order to view it. And it's effectively a form of censorship. So we're not going to show any of those videos now because we don't want you know, to this video to be censored in any way. Probably the easiest way to watch a lot of the footage is in the film made by Al Jazeera's investigative unit in March called October 7th. That's been age restricted too, but if you go to the article which Asa wrote about that documentary, we have a link to it there. Of course, you can find it by searching for, you know, Al Jazeera October 7 documentary. So there are ways to see it. But again, you know, aside from Al Jazeera, aside from the Electronic Intifada, a few other independent outlets, there's just total silence about this. Even when it's in a UN report, I mean, as Asa pointed out, the mainstream media is eager to play up anything from a UN report that they can use to attack Palestinians or affirm Israel's narrative. But when it comes to really digging into these reports and finding these crucial bits of information, you know, they're just not willing to do it. Thank goodness Asa is.
Yeah, and there was also that footage of the tanks in Kibbutz Be'eri from Israeli TV that we showed earlier. And the UN report alludes to several similar incidents which took place all over the south, including this one that you can see on screen now from Holit. There was an incident where an all-female tank crew attacked at least one house in the settlement of Holit in the south. And you can see on screen here, she's describing crashing the armored vehicle into the gate of the community, being asked immediately to fire on a house. She says, and asking, is there civilians there? The soldier says, we don't know if there's civilians there, just fire. She then says she didn't fire, but then immediately contradicts herself and says she fired at another house. So the UN report details a lot of this, and the tank crew, there was another incident that mentioned in the UN report where it says that another tank crew attacked Israelis and their Palestinian captors on their way to Gaza from Nir Oz, another nearby settlement. And this tank crew, the UN report states, quote, noticed hundreds of people crossing into Israel and back to Gaza, and they shot at them, including at vehicles laden with people, some of whom may have been hostages. And it even quotes one of the tank crew members in this report, and it says that this person, quote, knowingly applied the Hannibal Directive that day, and the person justified killing other Israelis in the following terms, quote, I decided that this is the right decision. I prefer stopping the abduction so they won't be taken. That's the Hannibal Directive in a nutshell.
Yeah. And it's obvious, even from a lot of the videos that were coming out on that day itself, that Hamas could not have been responsible for that level of destruction. You know, there were, it looks like hundreds of cars burnt and flattened. There were houses flattened in some of those kibbutzes. I mean, the level of destruction was immense.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, look, we've all been covering the recurring Israeli, you know, campaigns of destruction and genocide on the Gaza Strip for many, many years, and these scenes of destruction that we saw in the kibbutzes almost look like it could have been Gaza, not to the same extent, but there, you know, it's very obvious when a car has been flattened like that, or a house has been flattened like that. It hasn't been done by an AK-47 or even an RPG, right? Which we know the Palestinian resistance has. And those wrecked cars that you mentioned, according to Israeli occupation authorities, there were more than 1,000 of these cars destroyed on October 7th. And the Israelis later gathered all these cars and they piled them up in a junkyard near the settlement of Tekuma, in a sort of strange tourist attraction, which they call the car ceremony. And I found all these pro-Israel videos of the junkyard. And Tamara, thank you, she's just playing this video. And you can see here this van that he's describing. What he's saying about the vehicle here is that the ashes of 18 people were found inside it. And if you look at the extensive damage at the back there, it doesn't seem, you know, the frame is completely twisted, the car's completely burned. It doesn't look like it's been destroyed to me by a rocket propelled grenade, which we We know that the Palestinian resistance has, the damage is far too extensive, in my view, for that. And if we look at the second vehicle, which we're going to see presently...
And it's just the sheer volume, isn't it, Asa?
Right.
I mean, even
absolutely,
if they had rocket-propelled grenades, I mean, how many would they have had to have to do this kind of damage?
Right, and look at this second car. There's no way that was done by an RPG, right? It's completely destroyed and flattened. The third car, okay, you could argue there's bullet holes in it. That could have been carried out by a Palestinian fighter. But just look at behind this wall of cars. There's an actual wall of cars which had just been completely destroyed and crushed. You know, it's very clear they bear all the hallmarks of being destroyed by Israeli airstrikes, you know. It's there's no way that they were all destroyed by Palestinian fighters. There's just too much clear evidence of the Hannibal Directive being used.
Yeah.
And the same goes, of course, Asa mentioned this, but I just want to emphasize, when you look at the pictures of the houses in, for example, Kibbutz Be'eri, just whole streets of houses completely flattened. Again, that's not something you can do with AK-47s or rocket-propelled grenades.
No. Well, a year later, why is it still important to talk about this? You know, there are people who say that Israel has killed so many people since October 7th, 2023, that what happened on that day doesn't really matter. There's nothing that Hamas could have done that could ever justify Israel's crimes, you know, obviously. But why is it important?
Yeah, I do sometimes get people saying, oh, well, you know, why are you dwelling on this? Because, I mean, no matter what happened on October 7th, Palestinians were justified to carry out this act of resistance. And of course, nothing that happened that day could possibly justify what Israel is doing. And I just want to be clear that, you know, I personally don't pay attention to this because I think somehow you know, that there need to be excuses for the Palestinian resistance. It's not my job to do that or not do that. I'm interested in the truth. I mean, this is a Nakba. We talk about this as a Nakba, a catastrophe, as bad or even worse than what happened in 1948. It's certainly, in terms of the scale of the brutality, it's certainly as bad, if not worse, than 1948. And we're still talking about 1948. We're still unpicking Israel's lies and establishing the incontrovertible truth of what happened in 1948. And I think it's just as important to do this for October 7th, because the fake narrative is the one which will enter the history books if we don't challenge it at every level with the truth. You know, the mainstream media, the New York Times and those types, like to say that journalism is the first draft of history. Well, can you trust the first draft of history to the New York Times or to Jeffrey Gettleman, who fabricated that whole saga about you know, rapes that didn't happen, that of course we covered extensively as well? We can't. If we don't do this work, if we don't ensure the truth is told, no one else is going to do it. So I suspect we're going to keep coming back to October 7th time and time again, even as, of course, we continue to report on what is happening now in Gaza, in Lebanon, and the rest of Palestine.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Ali and Asa. Asa, tell us the name of your article once more so people can find it on the Electronic Intifada.
It's called How Israel Killed Hundreds of Its Own People on 7 October.
Great. Okay. Excellent. And people can find that on electronicintifada.net. Thank you so much, Asa. Thanks, Ali.